Well, I reckon that might have been the high point of this series. All downhill from here, baby. I've been a massive Resident Evil fan since I was a teenager. I remember reading about RE4's development in some gaming magazine way back in 2004. I remember travelling to the other side of the city I grew up in to find the last available copy in the state of Resident Evil 2 on Nintendo 64. I remember reading all the character bios on the official website, way back when those were actually worth checking out. I even liked Welcome to Raccoon City. If my love for Resident Evil was its own person, it'd be old enough to drink. Maybe not in the States, but it'd be old enough to vote, and if it could, it would vote for Resident Evil. What the fuck was that? I've played through every mainline entry in the series multiple times. Hell, I've even played through the entire series twice in the last 5 years, and replayed a handful of them a handful more times on top of that. When I met my last girlfriend, I played Resident Evil 3 to take my mind off her. When we broke up a few years later, I played Resident Evil 4 to take my mind off her. The reason I'm telling you all of this is for context. I am a massive, massive fan, but until a few months ago, I had never ever played the original Resident Evil. See, I grew up with 2 and 4, played them all through high school. I got my next RE game right after graduating, the GameCube remake of Resident Evil. I figured with a game that good, there was no point playing the original PS1 version. And to an extent, I was right. But for some reason, I got the itch. So this year, I gave it a shot.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
Whoa! What is it?
What? Oh! Oh no!
How come both Umbrella and you can intimidate him by taking his family as hostages?
It's a weapon. It's really powerful, especially against living things. Better take it with you.
But how about you, Barry?
I have this.
It's definitely something. Having almost finished it twice now, I can say with confidence that the remake is not only the superior version of Resident Evil, but it's also the true version of Resident Evil. It's the version of the game that, for whatever reason, they weren't able to make the first time around. I used to wonder why they never bothered to remake 2 and 3 in the same style. The RE1 remake turned out so damn good that it seemed a no-brainer to me, a license to print money. Now that I've played both, I know the answer. Sure, a remake of 2 and 3, in their original style anyway, would be awesome, but one needed to be remade. The original RE1 feels like a prototype in a lot of ways. It feels incomplete in both story and setting, and the remake corrects that. But there's something really special about the original Resident Evil. In fact, those rough edges that got sanded off in the remake are the things I love most about it. And that's what this series is going to be all about, more or less. A lot of the environmental detail and lore that was added in the remake was done with the knowledge of what came after. The story that was the original Resident Evil was changed to better fit the big picture. But once upon a time, this game was all we had, and any future stories had to fit into its narrative, not the other way around. This is all a roundabout way of saying that, as we delve into the original Resident Evil, we won't be using anything that came after as evidence for or against any possible theories. Now's about as good a time as any to go over what this series is all about. There are 5 things we're going to cover. 1. We'll analyze the game from both a gameplay and cinematic perspective. More than 2 decades later, this game still manages to be genuinely creepy, and it's in no small part thanks to the static camera. Resident Evil looks more like a horror film than a video game, and we'll look at how the camera controls the tension in the moment-to-moment gameplay by choosing what the player can and cannot see, as well as draw any parallels to classic horror films when and where we can. 2. We'll go over the environmental detail and see what we can put together. Same as in the Donkey Kong Country and Wild Gun series. Pretty self-explanatory. This leads nicely into the 3rd point. It's a theory I've been kicking around that I've taken to calling the nuclear town theory. I'll go into more detail later, but you ever see that 4th Indiana Jones movie? Remember the scene with the refrigerator and the nuclear bomb? That fake town was called the Doom Town. They built them on nuke testing sites to see the effect of the bombs on buildings. What's this got to do with Resident Evil? We'll get to that in good time. 4th, and probably my personal favourite, we'll do what we can to piece together the stories of Bravo Team, the STARS members who entered the mansion ahead of the main characters. Now, here and there I might reference future Resident Evil releases, but like I said earlier, over this series we won't be taking anything beyond this game as gospel. So what answers we got in the remake and Resident Evil 0 won't be factored into this investigation. And remember, Bravo Team weren't just random slobs, they were an elite team trained for combat. As we go on, there might be more to their story than any of us initially thought. And 5th, There are many inconsistencies between Chris and Jill's stories, but in future games, both are treated as canon. We'll see if we can figure out how the two often conflicting stories can coexist, and if one or the other is the true story of Resident Evil. Probably should have said something earlier, but we won't really be looking for all 5 this episode, because this one's all about the intro cinematic.
Resident Evil.
Alpha Team is flying around the forest zone situated in northwest Raccoon City, where we're searching for the helicopter of our compatriots Bravo Team, who disappeared during the middle of our mission. No, I haven't found it yet. Bizarre murder cases have recently occurred in Raccoon City. There are outlandish reports of families being attacked by a group of about 10 people. Victims were apparently eaten. Bravo Team went to the hideout of the group and disappeared.
Okay, first thing that jumps out at me is the name of the paper, the Something Times. The missing word ends in an M, so it isn't Raccoon or Raccoon City or Arclay or Umbrella, so it's got to be somewhere out of town. It's almost definitely still in the state, and likely nearby. Murders like this probably don't make front page news all over the country. That said, there is one super important detail this shot gives us. News of the outbreak quickly left town. I wasn't going to say anything, but it bothers me too much not to. The wording and formatting are so bad. I get that it's likely a translation error or whatever, but it still hurts my brain to see it. Now, there's something interesting about this headline, aside from the painful formatting and punctuation. It implies that STARS aren't based in Raccoon City, which directly contradicts what we see in 2 and 3. Not worth dwelling on. As I said at the beginning of the video, at one point this was all the Resident Evil we had, and the remake is definitely the canon version. There's a lot of that kind of thing in this game. It is what it is. The headline itself is a bit funny, because it makes out like the city itself is in danger. I don't think we ever got a body count pre-mansion incident, but as we just saw, it's a group of around 10 people. Hardly enough to take down a city, or warrant sending in the cavalry. You know what, it doesn't matter. Let's keep going. In this wide shot, we see smoke rising from the forest, coming from Bravo Team's helicopter. This raises quite a few questions. I don't want to spend too much time on them, but let's run over them real quick. It's night, yet the smoke is visible against the night sky. That might be possible in the city, but they're out in the wilderness. So the only real way they'd see smoke is if there was a fire beneath it all, or if their spotlight happened to catch it. Or maybe if it blocked out the stars in such a way that it was noticeable. Whatever, it's fine. Second, what could possibly have caused the helicopter to crash or explode? Zombies or zombie dogs aren't going to cause that. Later on, Rebecca says the helicopter made a forced landing and she booked it to the mansion. But that just raises more questions. Actually, I want to come back to that because what we find out later on gives us some ideas. This shot doesn't reveal much, but hey, it looks cool. Right to left movement is a common cinematic trick to instill a sense of evil, discomfort, dread, etc. I don't quite know how it works, but it's a psychological trick that we all fall for on some level. On top of that, long drawn out shots have a similar ability to ratchet up the tension, in a manner not too dissimilar to prolonged eye contact. Also, the low moving camera is roughly at the level of the dog's perspective, which might be a real subtle clue as to what took down the helicopter. The light we see here isn't flickering like fire, so it could be a headlight or spotlight, but at the same time, the plume of smoke is how Alpha Team found it, so if there was no fire, the wreck must have still been smouldering. Either the team arrived right after the crash, fast enough to catch the smouldering engine, or just late enough to have missed the fire.
It was Bravo Team's helicopter. Nobody was in it. But strangely, most of the equipment was still there. However, we soon discovered why.
Here's the first time we see the main characters of Resident Evil. The left to right camera movement could be interpreted as a positive motion. I don't personally think there was any intention behind it, but I could be wrong. Take a look at the order the shot reveals the characters to the player. We start with Joseph Frost, who's dog meat in about 30 seconds. Then we see Barry Burton, followed by Albert Wesker. Then there's a long gap before we see Jill and Chris, who get introduced individually. I probably should have said this earlier, but this entire series is going to be spoiler city all the way through, so maybe don't watch it if you haven't played the games. Alright, we all good? Jill and Chris are our two playable protagonists. The divide between Jill and Chris and the others could be a subtle hint as to how the team isn't truly united. Albert Wesker's a rat. Barry, while not a bad dude, is working for Wesker under duress. And Joseph's Joseph. Thing is, we really don't know all that much about Joseph. So can we be sure he wasn't working with Wesker too? Personally, I don't think he was. But you really can't rule anything out when it comes down to symbolism. When it comes to film, something as innocuous as where a character is sitting, or even just how they're sitting, can say a lot about them. Putting Frost next to two confirmed betrayers could mean something. In fact, there's even more to it than meets the eye. Let's take a look at the facts. Joseph Frost was originally a member of the ill-fated Bravo team, but after the reports of the murders taking place in the Arklay Mountains started to come out, he was hastily promoted to Alpha Team by none other than Wesker himself. I'd say that alone is pretty damning evidence. Wesker gets Joseph out of the Bravo team suicide mission in exchange for his subordination. Alternatively, he could have wanted another team member to test the bioweapons on, and Joseph was the best candidate. That seems more likely to me. Joseph was also good friends with Chris, Forrest, and Rebecca, so it's unlikely that he would have thrown them under the bus like that. Then again, Barry did. And why would Wesker need Barry's help? Why wouldn't he want to just test the bioweapon against Barry too? There's a lot to unpack there, so let's save it all for later. Back to the chopper. We never actually see what became of the helicopter in the original. There's nothing interesting behind that. They clearly just didn't have the budget for it. But we're told that none of the equipment was taken from it. This tells us that Bravo team were either ambushed or otherwise had to leave in a hurry. It also tells us that they're likely under-equipped for the dangers they're running into. That's something we'll touch on over the course of the series. For now, let's move on.
Hey! Come here!
Joseph finds a hand, still clutching a pistol. We know it doesn't belong to Kenneth, Forrest, Richard, Rebecca, or Enrico, so it's either the chopper pilot, Edward Dewey, or it's someone completely unrelated to Bravo Team. It's obviously Edward. It's holding a gun and found near the Bravo Team chopper. Who else is it going to be? But here's where it starts to get a bit messy. Edward's the pilot. What's left of him is clutching a pistol. Being the pilot, he'd likely be the last to get out of the chopper, meaning the others would have had enough time to grab their gear, but for some reason they didn't. So what happened? And how did the chopper get totaled if Edward wasn't in it? Rebecca says later that something went wrong with the engine, so that explains the landing. But as for how it got totaled, or why the team ended up scattered about the mansion without their gear, all I can really do at this point is speculate. I'm thinking they got attacked almost immediately after landing and tried to take off again, only for the team to have to bail out in a hurry as the chopper crashed. Maybe a Cerberus or zombie got into the chopper and attacked Edward. As I said before, Edward would have been the last out, and probably died fighting off the Cerberuses. You know what, I'm just going to call them zombie dogs from now on. So the chopper malfunctions, Edward sets it down, they immediately get attacked. Edward tries to take off, but something happens and he ends up crashing the chopper. The others bail, probably to get away from the dogs, and Edward goes down guns blazing. I'd like to think he died to buy the others some time. I have no way of proving that, but that's how it all shook out in my head. It's what I want to believe about him. Before we see the severed hand, we get a couple of cool but kind of funny shots of the zombie dogs. They're probably just in there for some colour, but I think there could be a bit more to it. The dogs were probably eating Dewey's corpse not that much earlier, and might have scattered when Alpha Team arrived. Or maybe they had moved on and were just lurking in the forest before they were attracted by either sound or the scent of the new arrivals. I was thinking about how the zombie dogs act way more like dogs than zombies do people, and I think I have an idea why. I'm no scientist, but I'm gonna do my best and try to make sense of this theory. A lot of human behavior is social. Our non-verbal communication and mannerisms are pretty damn complex, and I'm pretty confident in saying that they're not found in the same area of our brains as our motor skills, our autonomous functions, and nervous system. Again, not a scientist. When a human gets infected with the T-virus, the brain would likely die out in all what I'm going to label as non-essential areas. So the parts needed for motor skills and autonomous functions might remain intact, but the parts associated with memory, pattern recognition, whatever, probably just rot away. In a dog's brain, those mannerisms are probably more hardwired. The way the zombie dogs run and act like regular dogs could be because those mannerisms could be more akin to muscle memory than any form of expression. The way they bark and square up before charging are probably as intrinsic to the action as the necessary parts of the process, like the running or biting. Alright, let's keep going. Here we see both Chris and Jill shoot. Chris stands with his feet apart and calmly fires off one round. The camera is obviously from the perspective of one of the dogs, and the way it tilts back after the shot tells me he made his mark, so there's one down. Jill fires behind her while running, and we see in the next shot that they hit nothing. Might not mean anything, but I feel like this is planting the seed in the players' minds that Chris is the superior marksman, that overall it's probably better to engage with Chris and avoid with Jill. Next shot, both Wesker and Barry are shown running and firing. The shots from before, the ones we saw hitting the ground, they might not have been Jill's. First, the rhythm is off. She fires 2 shots, but the intervals between them aren't the same as the intervals between the 3 bullets hitting the ground. Now, when we see Wesker shoot, his first shot seems to be aimed pretty low. And yeah, the dogs aren't exactly tall, but the angle he fires at is like they're right on his heels. Maybe I'm looking into it too much. But it could be that he's just trying to make it look like he's trying to hit the dogs, when in reality he doesn't want to help the other STARS members at all. His job is to observe how they deal with the BOWs, so killing the zombie dogs kinda goes against his entire motivation. Also, he falls over at some point. I don't really understand why they put that in.
No! Don't go!
This shot is really cool. Having them so far away, looking up as Brad leaves them behind, really sells the hopelessness of the situation. It could be referencing a specific film or scene, but nothing immediately comes to mind. If you have any ideas, let me know in the comments. Speaking of references, we see certain shots from this intro in color a bit later, but here it's all black and white. It could just be aping the general vibe of 50s and 60s B-movie horror camp goodness, but I feel like it's very much a nod to Night of the Living Dead. This game and the series as a whole owes a lot not just to that film, but its creator George A. Romero himself, and I am quietly confident that this entire sequence is a humble acknowledgement of that.
Jill, run for that house!
We see the dogs give chase and the surviving STARS members resume running for their lives. Wesker's at the back, Jill and Chris in the middle, and Barry at the front. Not that it means anything to anybody, but it looks like the dogs were coming from the direction of the chopper, and Wesker might have been the last to start running. There are a lot of continuity errors in this sequence, but the one main takeaway is Chris ends up at the back of the group. He tries to take out some of the dogs and urges Jill to head for the mansion ahead. It's a blink or you miss it kind of detail, but it could go a long way as to telling us whose story is the real one out of Chris and Jill. See, when playing as Jill, she makes it to the mansion alongside Wesker and Barry, but when playing as Chris, Barry is the one that's missing. This seems to hint that Jill's story, or at least the start of it, is the true version of events. But then again, you don't really see Barry towards the end of that sequence at all. This might be him here, but it could also just be Jill's shoulder pad. Maybe the developers made this intro in such a way that it wouldn't seem out of place in either character's story. Whatever the case may be, let's save it for the next video. The search for Bravo team. Part 1 of Overthinking Resident Evil is officially done. I know it's not the greatest video on YouTube, but honestly, it's probably my favorite one I've made so far. If you've made it this far in, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for giving it a shot. I don't take it for granted. The Resident Evil videos are a lot harder to make than any of the others, but I'm gonna try and get at least one out a week. I guess we'll see how well that goes. Also, I don't want to jinx it, but if all goes well, I should have another couple of Overthinking series starting next month. Alright, I think that's it. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.